All right, here we are. We just got back from another class. Just got in about 10 minutes ago, and I always like to talk about this stuff while it's still fresh on my mind. This week's class was talking about the youth bulge and just kind of the changing demographics of the global population. I think it's something we always kind of either forget or don't really address that 90% of the world's youth live in developing countries. And I don't know, that's huge. And talking about what happens when you have youth culture in developing countries, kind of the capacity for both good and negative, or negatives that lead to good. Basically, just that there's a lot of untapped, not untapped, but there's just potential with youth culture, and it really can go a multitude of directions. Of one of the focuses being violent conflict and protests, especially particularly with male populations. We can kind of tie this to previous thoughts of how gender is woven into educational systems and reinforced, and is the male stereotype of being predisposed to violence uh, true in actuality. I mean, that's something definitely worth discussing, especially as masculine roles are way more rigid, I'd say, in the developing world than they are. It's actually the changing of masculinity is something relatively new for the global north. So I think that's an interesting kind of thing to think about as we talk about a rising youth culture and the culprit of these great political changes like Arab Spring, to child soldiers is kind of blamed or directed at male, yeah, male culture, male masculinity. Another thing we didn't really, we sort of touched on today, but then the discussion, really interesting discussion, but we definitely focus on the global south, as they're the most impacted by global education. But just talking about youth bulges, I think one of the films shown in class today discussed about how the baby boom, if we're gonna examine the how the youth bulge affects societies for at least the global north, the boomers are aging, and the economy is kind of catering around them because they're the oldest and in power, but they're a bulge of what was once young population now aging, and is showing the societal change and economic changes that go along with it. So uh, as countries develop and as populations rise, there's kind of four stages of development. It's actually really interesting that we talked about it this week because I'm learning about the same stuff in my environmental science class, where we're calculating mortality rates as it links to population. Really, really happy stuff there. Um, but that an explosion of growth is going to be inevitable with, oh, excuse me, any developing country. The first stage being you have high fertility, high mortality, a lot of babies not surviving to adulthood. So when that decreases, then you have this explosion of population with a still high fertility. And then once people realize they don't need as many babies because their babies are going to survive, or they're moving to urban centers where it's economically disadvantageous to have multiple children, then you see populations leveling off until they initially start regressing, like we see in most of the global north and Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Australia. Um, so yeah, it was a real interesting class. A lot of stuff to talk about. It was really a lot of previous readings and thoughts that you could tie into the discussion this week, which was always leads to kind of very well versed discussions. And looking forward to next week's class. So until next week.